New section. Chapter 1. I ended up in a hospital where they kept me for months after I arrived back in New York, staring at a wall, stunned silent, frozen, frigid with anger and grief. My willingness to eat confused and annoyed the staff, confounded their efforts to understand what I was doing there. For months, an explanation for my presence escaped them completely. But I wasn't about to help them with the problem. Eventually, they were forced to release me, still unable to diagnose the obvious. So here it is finally, and I hope they're paying attention. I was in the hospital because it was convenient. It was the only way to get me out of England. I was not interested in starving, killing, slashing, depriving, maiming, or punishing myself. I was dying, of course, but then we all are, every day, in perfect increments. I was dying of loss. The only help for my condition, then as now, is that I refused to let go of what I loved. I wrote everything down, at first in choppy fragments, a sentence here, a few words there. It was the most I could stand at the time. Later, I wrote more, my grief muffled but not eased by the passage of time. When I go back over my writing now, I can barely read it. The happiness is the worst. Some days I can't bring myself to remember, but I will not relinquish a single detail of the past. What remains of my life depends on what happened 6 years ago. In my brain, in my limbs, in my dreams, it is still happening. Chapter 2. It took all this time for the war to end. I was going to say for good, and even now I don't want to press my luck. The occupation itself lasted only 9 months. By Christmas that first year, it was over. By then, I was back in New York City, not because I wanted to be, but because I was half dragged and half deported, and the final half was blackmail, and after all the rest of the things I managed to resist, I didn't have the strength left for that particular fight. The worst part about those years wasn't the hospital or the solitude or the war or even being away from Edmund. It was the not knowing. It's fashionable nowadays to talk about cramming a whole life into a few years, especially when people turn up dead at the end of it, which increasingly they do. But for me, it's been the opposite. When I left England, I entered limbo, and for all that time, I was waiting to come home. You think I'm exaggerating that I should qualify my statement. I waited, yes, but I also took a job, read books, spent days in air raid shelters, filled out rationing papers, wrote letters, stayed alive. But the truth is, nothing distracted me from waiting. The time simply passed. First, of course, I was reunited with my family. I met my half sister, less than half really, an eighth, a 50th. They named her Leonora. Snub nosed, precious, and refreshingly normal, which is the line Davina's been using 200 or 300 times a day for half a decade now. I know exactly how the conversation with my father. I knew I know exactly how the conversations with my father go. Thank heavens there are no problems with Lenora. Why, the money alone that's been wasted on, meaningful nod. And my father, looking uncomfortable, answers, of course, darling, and silently taps his knuckles against their custom made white Canadian birch headboard for luck. I was precious at her age, too. For my father's sake, I've pretended to be nice to Lenora. Not that she cares. She assumes admiration. Well, good for her. It's a lot easier that way. I left the bosom of my family within a few days of being discharged from the hospital. Most of the schools had closed, and it was hard to see the point of education in the midst of all that death and destruction anyway, so I moved into a derelict office building near what used to be Grand Central. No one wanted to live in that neighborhood anymore, but I liked it. The sky was bigger now, except for the occasional shooting. It was quiet. Around the corner was the New York Public Library main branch, 42nd and 5th. I assumed they were desperate for staff. Everyone in that neighborhood was. At the interview, they asked me how I felt about the bomb threats and snipers, and were impressed by what they took to be my courage. I was the only one who applied for the job, which may explain why they didn't seem to mind about my previous job experience. Hall monitor in a loony bin. Day after day, I attended my duties, which were virtually non existent. It was silent in there, cavernous and empty. Some days, the only people who came in were our regulars, a small band of old fashioned primary source freaks and intellectual seekers. Everyone else stayed home and used the internet, less worried about the quality of information than about suicide bombers. Nearly everyone got used to living without little luxuries like library books. It was only a few months ago that there was finally a pause in the thousands of war being raged all over the planet. Or was it one big war? I forget. I think everyone has. A few days after the borders between the US and England finally reopened for casual passage, the letter from Piper arrived. For the longest time, I couldn't bring myself to read it. For once, my father's influence came in handy. He was trying to make amends, which I appreciated. I was one of the first people they allowed to come back. You'd laugh at the complications of my journey. From start to finish, the trip took almost a week. Of course, it wasn't all traveling, there was a lot of waiting around too, but I was used to that. When the plane finally did touch down, I half expected, half prayed that somehow a miracle would happen and Edmund would appear at the airport just like last time with his cigarette and sweet doggy tilt to his head. But how could he? I was disappointed nonetheless. The procedure of checking us through was complicated, so I waited with a small, anxious crowd, a few Americans, but mostly Brits who got stuck on the wrong side of the Atlantic when borders all over the world started to close. Our right to be in England had to be double and triple confirmed, with sheaves of paperwork and fingerprinted identification cards in addition to the new kind of passports we'd been issued. All the officials at the airport carried guns, but underneath their grim expressions you could detect a hint of excitement. We were almost tourists, the first anyone had seen in years. For them, we represented the end of a long, hard winter. Like daffodils, they greeted us with a barely disguised relief. When I stepped outside, the familiar smell of that rainy April day hit me so hard I felt dizzy and had to put my bag down and wait for the spell to pass. The airport was unrecognizable from my last visit, completely overgrown with gorse and ivy and huge prehistoric looking thistles. Just as Isaac had predicted, the landscape was happily romping away from civilization. I half expected to see stags and wild boars on the runway. Except for a couple of army jeeps, the parking lot was empty. Their owners had hacked a space in the dense scrub that now covered everything, but the clearings looked temporary. It was like landing in a wild place. I'm glad I hadn't seen the condition of the runways beforehand. The soldier had stamped my passport family in heavy black capital letters, and I checked it now for reassurance and because I liked how fierce the word looked. I'm coming, I said silently to everything I left behind, and headed for the single ragged bus that would take me home. Chapter 3. While waiting for my connection out of London, I found a phone booth that worked and punched in the number Piper sent me. A man's voice I didn't recognize answered after a long time and said no one else was there. So I left a message with my approximate time of arrival, and before he hung up and paused and said, "They're so happy you've come." There was no such thing as a direct route. 7 hours and two buses later, I finished my final leg of the journey just outside a village that looked as if it had been deserted for a century. The bus was early and there was no one around, but coming down the road towards me was a graceful young woman in a heavy curtain of dark hair and the most perfect pale skin I'd ever seen. Her face lit up with a radiant smile when she saw me, and then she was running, and of course it was the smile that tipped me off that she was the same as ever. And then I heard the voice crying Daisy, which was exactly the same as it had always been. And I tried to look at her face and connect her with the little girl I knew, but my eyes were blinded by tears and I couldn't focus. She didn't cry. You could tell from her expression she'd made up her mind she wouldn't. She just looked at me with her huge solemn eyes and looked like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "Oh, Daisy," she said. Just that, and then again, "Oh, Daisy." I couldn't even find a voice to answer, so I embraced her instead. Eventually, she pulled away and leaned down to pick up my bag. "Everyone's desperate to see you," she said. And then, "We still haven't any petrol for the Jeep. Shall we walk?" Then I laughed, because what if I'd said no? And I picked up the other bag, and she took my hand just as if we'd been together all along, and she was still 9 years old, and we walked home in the spring sunshine along the flowering, overgrown hedgerows, past the apple trees in blossom, and the fields gone to seed up the hill. And everything she hadn't explained well enough in her letter she told me now. About Isaac and Aunt Pen and Osbert. Neither of us mentioned Edmund. Here are some of the things she told me. She told me Aunt Pen's death had finally been confirmed 2 years after she first left for Oslo. I knew that. But I didn't know she'd been shot trying to re-enter the country a few months after the war started, desperate to get back to her family. Poor sisters, I thought, both murdered by their children. Our war and theirs turned out to be remarkably similar. There were snipers and small groups of rebel everywhere, disorganized bands of covert fighters, and half the time you couldn't tell the good guys from the bad guys, and neither could they. Buses blew up, and occasionally an office building or post office or a school, and bombs were found in shopping malls and packages, and sometimes, for no reason that anyone could explain, there'd be a ceasefire, and then someone somewhere would step on a landmine and we'd be all off again. You could ask 1,000 people on 7 continents what it was all about, and you wouldn't get the same answer twice. Nobody really knew for sure, but you could bet one or more of the following words would crop up: oil, money, land, sanctions, democracy. The tabloids waxed nostalgic for the good old days of World War II when the enemy all spoke a foreign language and the army went somewhere else to fight. And yet, life went on. Although the borders remained sealed to tourists, life started returning to something a little closer to normal after the occupation ended, which was soon after I left. By the time it became official that Aunt Pen wasn't coming home, Osbert was 18, and since no one else was interested in adopting what was left of the family, it fell to him. Though, as Piper said, nothing much changed. He moved out last year, she told me, to live with his girlfriend, but we still see him all the time. Isaac apparently was still Isaac. He spoke more now, but mostly to the animals. He'd spent the last 5 years building up the flock of tangly-haired sheep again, and he and Piper had goats, a small herd of cows, pigs, 2 riding horses, a pony, and chickens. The vegetable gardens were huge, with a section left untouched to provide seeds for next year. They decided to be self-sufficient. It seemed the safest thing to be now, and the natural way for them to live. In addition to the farm, Piper said people brought Isaac livestock with a variety of physical and mental problems because they knew he could fix them, and it was a luxury these days to give up on a sick or dangerous animal. She said people in the country called him the witch doctor, but in a nice way. And then she told me about herself, how she was in love with Jonathan and how he was training to be a doctor and she wanted to be one too. The universities had opened again, but the waiting list to get in was long, and Piper thought she might not qualify for entry this year. I could tell by what she said that it wasn't some temporary teen romance, but what else would you expect of Piper? She told me he loved her. Well, of course he did. I told her I couldn't wait to meet him, and it was true. We walked the last few hundred yards uphill in silence, and when we approached the drive, I could see the honey-colored stone of the house. My hand tightened around Piper's, and my heart stuttered, contracting so hard on each beat that the blood whooshed in my ears. Isaac was there to greet us, holding a pretty border collie by the collar. He smiled as I hugged him, and smelled his familiar smell, and I saw how he'd grown taller than me, and quiet and slender and strong. I wanted to come collect you, he said gravely, but Piper wouldn't let me. She's very possessive, you know. And he smiled at us both. I think it was the longest sentence I'd ever heard him speak. It was accompanied by a familiar tilt of the head and a slightly raised eyebrow, and I felt the ground rush away from me, so strong was the memory and the fear. Come on, Piper said, taking hold of my hand once more. Let's go see Edmund. Chapter 4. 6 years. My fantasies were as constant as I was, Edmund and me living some sort of life. That was it. I never bothered filling in the details. The details didn't matter. The day was warm, and Edmund was outdoors, sitting carefully upright on a lawn chair in the white garden, his eyes half closed. He sat facing away from us, and Piper went and knelt in front of him. Edmund, she whispered, her hand resting lightly on his knee. Edmund, look who's come. He turned his head then, and I couldn't even move forward towards him, or make my face have an expression. He was thin, much thinner than I am now. His face worn. When Isaac was lean and graceful, he just looked gaunt. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he turned his head back away from me and closed them again. Closed the subject. I wasn't prepared. Piper pulled a metal folding chair over and pushed me into it and went off to make tea, and at first I just looked at him, and eventually he looked back with his eyes the color of unsettled weather. His arms were covered in scars, some new, some healing over, some disappearing into thin white lines. I could see the same thin lines etched around his neck, and he developed a nervous habit of running his fingers along the ridges over and over again. Edmund. I didn't know how to continue. Not that it mattered. To him, I was still thousands of miles away. The borders were still closed. I sat there awkward and not knowing what to do. I wanted to touch him, but when he opened his eyes again, the expression in them was poison. Piper came back with the tea. Good old, reliable English tea. 2 world wars ago, battlefield nurses gave cups of tea to the wounded, and it leaked through their bullet holes and killed them. I turned and looked at the garden, meticulously tended by whom, I wondered. The child angel had been cleared of moss and planted all around with snowdrops and white narcissus that poured out an overpowering scent. I thought of the ghost of the long dead child watching us, its desiccated bones sunk deep into the ground below. On the warm stone walls, climbing roses were just coming into bloom, and great twisted branches of honeysuckle and clematis wrestled each other as they tumbled up and over the top of the wall. Against another wall were white apple blossoms on branches, um, cut into sharp crucifixes and forced to lie flat against the stone. Below, the huge filled lips of giant tulips in shades of white and cream nodded in their beds. They were almost finished now, spread open too far, splayed, exposing obscene black centers. I never had my own garden, but I suddenly recognized something in the tangle of this one wasn't beauty. Passion, maybe, and something else. Rage. It was Edmund, I thought. I recognized him in the plants. I turned back and met his eyes, hard and angry and unyielding. It was such a beautiful day, warm and full of life. I couldn't reconcile it with this scene. Piper looked at me and smiled a tired smile. Give him time, she said, as though he couldn't hear us at all. Well, what choice did I have? After that day, I could barely enter the garden without a huge effort of will. The air was suffocating, charged, and the hungry plants sucking at the earth with their ferocious appetites. You could almost watch them grow, pressing their fat green tongues through the black earth. They emerged selfish and starving, gasping for air. Once inside, I couldn't breathe. I felt claustrophobic, choked, desperately thinking bright thoughts, so Edmund wouldn't get inside my head and know how terrified and furious and guilty I felt. But I don't think he even tried. And still he sat there, as still and as cold as the statue of the dead child. I sat with him for a shorter and shorter time each day as my fear took over, and the grasping whiteness of the garden blinded me. I thought of excuses, involved myself totally in the farm. There was plenty of work to do, so I could fool myself that no one noticed the obvious. It was like not eating. Everyone knew. After a few days, I found myself alone in the barn with Isaac. Piper had gone to meet with Jonathan, returning from a week at the hospital. Travel was so difficult that it made sense for him to stay for long stretches without coming home. For once, Isaac looked at me directly, the way he looked at the dogs. Talk to him, he said, with no preface. I can't. Why else did you come? He won't listen. He is listening. He can't help listening. That's what caused all the trouble for him in the first place. I knew any of them would tell me any of the whole story, but I didn't dare ask. I didn't dare know. I looked at Isaac's eyes with their strange mix of warmth and dispassion. I could see that he suffered for Edmund as much as he could suffer for another human being. And suddenly, the thing inside that had kept me focused all these years rose to my throat like vomit. It was strong as poison, and for once, I didn't fight it down or try to reshape it as something polite. If he's listening so hard, I shouted, why can't he hear that the only way I've managed to survive every day for all these years is because of him? He knows, Isaac said. He's just forgotten how to believe it. I said nothing for a long time. The garden frightens me. Yes, he said. We stared into each other's eyes, and I saw what I needed to see. Keep telling him, he said calmly, and then went back to feeding the pigs. There was nothing else to do. I kept telling him. I returned to the garden and sat with him hour after hour, saying it again and again, and most of the time I could feel the doors slam shut so he didn't have to listen. But I was determined. Listen to me, you bastard. He didn't move. Listen to me. In the end, something happened. In the end, the warmth and the scent and the heavy, slow buzz of bees seduced me, worked on my brain like opium. So the tightly clenched core of fear and fury that had sustained me all these years began to unfurl. I began to open too. I love you, I told him at last. And then I told him over and over until the words no longer sounded like words. And finally he turned to me, his eyes dull, and spoke. Then why did you leave me? And so I tried to explain about our journey and the day Piper and I were at the house looking for him as usual, and the phone ringing, my father's voice at the other end, and how for all those years I wished I hadn't picked up the phone that day, but I did. And by the time I realized what his plan was for me, there was nothing I could do, because he knew where I was and he had the international connections. And despite all my journeys and triumphs over adversity, I was still just a 15-year-old kid stuck in a war, powerless in the face of official medical certificate requiring immediate hospitalization abroad. My father thought he was doing what was best for me. Edmund turned his face away. Of course he knew the story. He must have heard it 100 times from Piper. I guess he had to hear it from me. I leaned over and took both his hands in mine, and I pressed them to my face, and when he tried to pull away, I wouldn't let him. And then, not caring whether he was listening or not, I told him everything else. I told him about all the years reliving every second of our time together, the years trying to find him, the years of nothing and nobody else. And every minute of every year, I was trying to come home. We sat there as day turned to twilight, and twilight to evening, and the moon rose, and the constellations moved across the sky. And I talked, and he listened, and it took almost all night to tell him everything, but I didn't stop until there was nothing left to tell. And when I finally went to let go of his hands because mine were cold and exhausted and cramped, I couldn't. We sat like that, close together in the white garden, lit by the cold white light of the stars, with only each other for warmth. Okay, he said finally. And he said it out loud, his voice odd and strained, like he'd forgotten how to speak. That was it. Okay. Then he freed his hands and took mine, stiff and icy cold, and wrapped them in his, which were warm. It was a start. Chapter 5. According to Piper, after the occupation finished, most of the young men were drafted into the army, and a good portion of the suburban population began to redistribute itself towards the countryside, where it was supposed to be safer. Cooperatives sprang up to handle the farm work and try to keep everyone fed. Piper met Jonathan through their cooperative. He worked with one of the doctors, and she ran the milking barns. There was no need for courtship. They simply met one day and were together after that. He lived with them now. It was Jonathan who answered my phone call from London. He and Piper made a good couple. Where she was serious and gentle, he was intense and humorous, utterly engaged in the world in a way none of her family really was. I liked him immediately. As outsiders, we both saw our role somewhere in the quadrant of privileged caretakers. I knew he protected her where he could. Jonathan told me about all the years that followed my departure. Eventually, the schools reopened, farm shops sold food, distribution networks sprang up, and the black market offered everything from imported drugs to new shoes if you could afford to pay. It's been a bad time for so many people, he said, and Piper looked at her hands. So many deaths. Tell me what happened, I said finally, late one evening, when the sky was striped pink and gold and the garden was lit with the last rays of the setting sun. I knew that Edmund and Isaac had survived, but that's all I knew. I didn't know how or what they'd seen, what they'd done. Piper remained silent, so it was from Jonathan that I heard the last piece of the story. According to Jonathan, Edmund and Isaac had lived peacefully at Gateshead Farm throughout the summer, as Piper and I had at Reston Bridge. Then things started to change. The atmosphere darkened, they heard reports of violence and unrest, and both Edmund and Isaac knew, in the way they knew things, that something bad was going to happen. They tried to warn people, tried to talk to Dr. Jameson. He listened, was sympathetic, but he knew it would take an immense leap of faith for anyone to act. The small community was too settled and too frightened to run and hide in the woods because there's something in the air and the premonitions of a couple of kids. It wasn't enough to make them leave. You can't really blame them, especially now. Isaac knew that his first responsibility was to survive and to make sure Edmund survived. But Edmund didn't see it that way. The way he saw it, if they left, they abandoned all those people to certain death. For the first time, they fought, and Isaac proved the stronger of the two. He turned the full force of his will on Edmund, bullied him. He did what was required to make sure they escaped alive, and they did. But it divided them. Isaac could live with the consequences, and Edmund couldn't. They went into hiding together, but it was too dangerous. The area was swarming with soldiers and vigilantes, and Isaac knew that in order to survive, they'd have to keep moving. He tried to convince Edmund to return home, but he wouldn't, or maybe he couldn't. In the end, Isaac did what he never thought was possible, and that was leave Edmund behind. Maybe he hoped Edmund would follow him. Isaac hid for some time in the village. Jonathan looked at Piper and she looked away. He arrived here 2 days after you left. I gasped as if I'd been punched hard in the stomach. The things that break your heart when you think there's nothing left to break. Jonathan took a deep breath. When Isaac left, Edmund went back to Gateshead, even though he knew how dangerous it was. He'd worked and lived side by side with every one of those people for months, and perhaps he felt that he could warn them better, make it clearer, force them to listen. He could save them. Well, obviously he couldn't. He must have given up at last, escaped when he saw there was nothing more he could do. Jonathan shook his head. How all those people, including the children, would have hidden in the woods with no food. He paused. There were thousands of stories just like this one, and mostly they didn't end happily. None of us said a word. Jonathan took another breath and continued. We don't know exactly what happened next, but you know what happened at Gateshead. You and Piper know better than anyone. Soon afterwards, Edmund was found a few miles away by soldiers, not our soldiers. He was half dead with starvation, and you can imagine what else. They held him for over a month but didn't harm him, except that there was never enough food, and they didn't bother wasting what they had on him. We don't know why they kept him alive, they just did. In the end, they got so used to him and the fact he never tried to move or speak or escape that he just stood up one day and walked off. He walked home. God knows how he made it to the house, but he did, and that's where Piper and Isaac found him, sick and starving and silent. They managed to get him up to the lambing barn where they were hiding, but he wouldn't speak at all or tell them what happened, not for, he looked at Piper, more than a year. You've seen what he's done to himself, Jonathan said, as if he hadn't suffered or been punished enough, and for what? For being alive, I guess. We didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, Piper spoke, her voice soft. And then there was the garden. It took a long time for him to do anything other than sit in a chair, but he started slowly, just digging and helping with the vegetables and still not saying much of anything. And each day he did more. It helped him. You could see how much it helped him. He weeded and pruned and dug up old bulbs and put them away for winter and collected seeds and labeled it. And when spring came, he started to plant things, not just for food, for something else. She looked at me. He never cared that much for the garden before, but once he started working, he was compulsive, tireless. Day after day, he worked until well after dark, and there was no point calling him in. He couldn't stop, even if he wanted to. It was worse for him in winter, with so much less to do, but even then we'd find him out in the snow, clearing off branches so they wouldn't break, and wrapping plants in sacks and hay to keep them from freezing. Sometimes his intensity was frightening, but afterwards he seemed calmer. He never told us about going back to Gateshead or what happened when he was with the soldiers. We never heard from him what happened after he and Isaac split up. Jonathan found out most of it from people who saw him, who knew what was going on. He's locked it inside, and this is how it comes out. She pointed to the dense, thorny branches of a blood rose, cut and pinioned in cruel horizontals against the wall, yet still wild and heavy with dark red blooms. We watched a honeybee lurch from one fat flower to the next, drunk and staggering under the weight of all that botanical destiny. And suddenly I knew something with terrifying clarity. I knew Edmund had witnessed the massacre, seen the people murdered in cold blood, the men and women, the children, dying, the animals murdered or left to starve. I don't know how he survived, and I probably never will know, but I knew unequivocally that he was there. I couldn't begin to imagine the effect on him. I didn't have to. I looked at Piper. I could see in her eyes that she didn't know. Jonathan wouldn't have guessed. As for Isaac, doesn't he know everything that happens to any one of us? That's it, Piper said. That's the end. But I knew it wasn't. They left out a chapter, the one where the hero comes home to find me gone. Chapter 6. I became a gardener of sorts. It was the only way to talk to him, not with words, but with hard work and the feel of old tools and with fat bulbs buried and wading deep in the rich soil. I watched him and learned from him, digging and planting and making things grow. At first, he didn't help me, but I didn't need his help. I just needed to be there with him in the sunshine, planting tiny seeds in the crumbling earth and willing them to flower. Now we walk, and he talks to me sometimes, tells me the names of the plants we come across in the field. They're hard to remember, and there are too many of them, and the only ones I manage to keep in my head are the ones that saved my life. Corylus avellana, hazelnuts. Rubus fructuosus, blackberries. Agaricus campestris, field mushrooms. Roripa nasturtium aquaticum, watercress. Allium ursinum, wild garlic. Malus domestica, apples. Sometimes we sit together the way we did 1,000 years ago, and we don't say a word, but just listen to the thrushes and the larks. He even smiles occasionally, remembering, and that's when I turn sideways and look at him, trace his scars with my finger, and without speaking, I tell him again and again that I'm home. And so after all this time, we're together, Edmund and I. The facts of his existence are plain. I know that he will never silence those unspeakable voices. He heard how people killed and how they died, and their voices infected him, coursed through him, poisoned him. He didn't know how to turn off the noise or turn the hate back onto the world like the rest of us. He turned it on himself. You can see that from the scars on him. Isaac survived because he listened to animals. He could help them, which makes pain bearable. And Piper had me. By saving Piper, I saved myself, and all the things that might have killed us were also the things that saved us. Saved from the ravages of war by stubbornness and ignorance and an insatiable hunger for love. I have no idea how damaged Edmund is. I just know that he needs peace and he needs to be loved. And both those things I can do. So now I'm here with him and with Piper and Isaac. and Jonathan, and the cows and the horses and the sheep and the dogs and the garden, and all the hard work of running a farm and staying alive in a country deformed and misshapen by war. I know all about those conditions, only this time they're outside of me. And anyway, fighting back is what I've discovered I do best. After all this time, I know exactly where I belong, here with Edmund. And that's how I live now. The end.